Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Exposure Scientist podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing a recent EPA decision for banning a certain chemical using consumer products. Yesterday, which is April 30th, EPA issued a final decision, a ruling banning a product called methylene chloride in consumer products. So you may have heard of methylene chloride. You've definitely heard of the consumer products that it is typically used in. And I think it's important to understand what the products are, what the potential risks are, and whether or not this may be warranted. So, methylene chloride is a chemical that's also known as dichloromethane. It is used a lot as intermediaries in the manufacture of other products, but it's also used in paints, paint removal, solvents, metal cleaning, chemical processing. It's used in a variety of um, processes that we are typically using every day. I could probably go down to my garage and find something that contains methylene chloride. So, based on EPA's recent decision, they are no longer going to allow methylene chloride to be used in consumer products. And I'll give some of the justification. Some of the information says since 1980, EPA has found that at least 88 people have died from acute exposure to methylene chloride. Acute exposure is a high concentration of a lot of exposure all at once, and typically uh, neurological issues manifest from exposure to methylene chloride in that scenario. So, another worry or concern for exposure to methylene chloride are a number of different cancer outcomes. They have linked, the EPA in their assessment has linked liver and lung cancer and brain and blood cancers to methylene chloride. So the question is, based on this information and based on the use of this, and a lot of this was done following a reassessment of potential exposures to toxic chemicals or what they identify as toxic. Is where is the trend on where we're going from use of products, of consumer products that contain these substances, and how are we addressing the potential harms that could be caused by them. Now, typically when you go look at one of the consumer products that contain these, they have a lot of different warnings on there. The potential health effects or certain ways that you should be using it. Um, is this a scenario that is going to be tenable for the future? So, for example, if we are using methylene chloride and it's an effective product and we have to go to something that is less effective, what are the ramifications of that going to be? Are there risk assessments that are done, realistic risk assessments? I have to dive deeper into their decision making process to identify how they identified realistic risk versus the potential. Just for example, what are they speciating this between occupational exposures and consumer exposures? I myself, as a consumer, I may use something that may contain methylene chloride or spray paint or something maybe once or twice a year. Is that taken into consideration as far as the exposure variable inputs they're modeling out for the risk that is caused by exposure to either methylene chloride or any other consumer product? Additionally, you have to consider, and here's where it comes down. Maybe they are replacing this product with something that is not as effective. Maybe it's something that has been sitting on a shelf to be potentially used, but maybe is not effective as effective. Maybe you have to use more of a different product. What I'm trying to get here or get at here is that when you make a change and replace one product with something else, you have to understand what the risk is. And you have to understand there may be elevated risk. So, for example, this is the data. And again, I'm going on the articles that have released. I need to do a deep dive into the methylene chloride risk assessment process because, as of recent years, that it has obviously been identified as a potential hazard, um, but the complete ban on it from a use and viability aspect is that something that is tenable. So The thought is we understand what the risks are for methylene chloride. We understand how to control them based on years of experience. And again, it says since 1980, a certain number of deaths have occurred from exposure or, associated with it. Is there something that is going to replace it that we are not certain of the health hazards? Not, and I say this from a not certain aspect of for cancer outcomes, there's a long latency. Of course, we do animal testing, we do mechanistic testing to identify, we do something else called SAR, structural activity relationship, to see if there's potential for outcomes, uh, carcinogenic outcomes. But is there something that won't show up in the data for 10, 15, 20 years from now from what we may be replacing this with, or what may be as effective, or maybe that replacement we have to use a higher concentration of. It is important that whatever decisions you make, whether it's replacement of a product or banning, I'll just say something I'll say maybe a body of water where you have to filter it out. Whatever process change you are making, what are the downstream effects? And I think that's the important thing to understand with not only methylene chloride, but a number of different other constituents or chemicals um, that may be uh, on the, I'll say, chopping block, may be something that is going to be eliminated from use. Um, what's going to be replacing it? What are the dangers? What are the hazards? What are the risks from that replacement? Are there any? Do we understand them well? Or is there something else that we are not as sure of, but we are quick to ban? I say quick, is obviously years in the making, but quick to ban one constituent to replace it with another. And then that next one, we don't know what the potential health outcomes are for 10, 15 years because maybe a long latency for the development of disease, whether it's working with the product or manufacturing the product or what have you. And then we have to have people that study it. Is the replacement product studied well enough? Is it effective? Is it studied at a certain concentration? These are all questions that we think about as exposure scientists when something is removed from the market or something is changed around or there's a rule that says something has to now be controlled. Well, maybe the controlling factor changes the uh, maybe that target control doesn't only control that one particular constituent. Maybe it has a secondary effect on other things that may be that we may not want to control. I'll just give this for example. But if it's water, if there's water treatment, um, maybe there's some kind of filtration or some kind of treatment within the water that are required because of new maximum contaminant levels that we're controlling for different constituents. Maybe it's affecting the disinfectant level. That's a secondary effect of installing a control system to control something else. What are the dangers and risks of the downstream effect of that? And I think that's very important to acknowledge and understand, both as exposure scientists, as rule makers, as the general population or general public, to understand, what am I being exposed to now? Do we have sufficient data to support its use? Is it going to be something in 10 to 15 years that's going to say, oops, maybe it's just as harmful because we've had to use a higher concentration for it to be more effective? These are all questions that we're going to be asking. So, as we look at this a ban on methylene chloride and its use, and where else are things going? I've seen more and more that EPA has focused on this from the toxic control aspect and reassessment of these materials. Are there other things that are going to be banned uh, from consumer products or products in general? How are these bans going to impact how things are made? Is it going to add additional costs? Is it going to make things less effective? Is it going to require us to use more of a product? These are all questions that are going to come up not only for this product, but in future products. So when you're looking at EPA and you're looking at the regulations and or things that they're looking at, maybe take a look and say, okay, well, they're thinking or proposing banning this or thinking about banning this or doing an assessment. What happens if we do? What is the replacement product? Manufacturers have to think about this too. If it's an intermediary in their manufacturing process, what are they going to replace it with? Is it as effective? Is it safe? So all questions that come up in the exposure scientist's mind. So if you have any questions about methylene chloride, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into their risk assessment for identifying what their rationale was, what their exposure inputs were, to see how realistic they were in relation to their general um, very conservative input models. If you have any questions about methylene chloride or any of the regulation as far as toxic chemicals from EPA stance, please feel free. I'd love to have a conversation further about this. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and I look forward to speaking to you with the next one. Thank you.